Vanessa worried about Tayo, not knowing how best to comfort him. She'd hoped that he would return to France with her, but he seemed keen to spend the summer with his cousin, which she could understand, given that this was his only family in England. In the meantime, although she'd been dreading the time away in France with her parents, things had not been as bad as she feared, at least not in the beginning. It helped that Grandma and Grandad were not there at the same time, and that the weather in Saint-Jean was heavenly. There was also Madame Pagnol's Provençal cooking, which could never be underestimated. Vanessa's school friend Jane had come to join them for a few days too, so all was going well until Mother received the letter from Nancy Murdoch. N for notoriously nattering nitwit Nancy, who wrote to inform them, never asking, always announcing, that she and her husband would be visiting over the Bastille holiday. Father was delighted. Mother was furious. Mr. Murdoch had been Father's friend for many years. They met in 1945, while taking the summer course at Oxford in preparation for colonial service. It was there that they both learnt their first few words of local African languages, as well as acquiring some knowledge of tropical medicines and diet. Mr. Murdoch was subsequently posted to Tanganyika, while Father had gone to Nigeria, but they had stayed in touch over the years. Whenever the two got together, they drank, smoked cigars, and reminisced about the good old times and their chums in the Corona Club. It was not such a jolly time for Mother, who was left entertaining Nancy. Unlike some talkative types with whom one could and ah without paying much attention, Nancy's chatter was of the tiring variety that demanded responses. She spoke incessantly about herself, which was why, when Father refused to say no to the Murdochs, Mother insisted upon inviting Uncle Tony to balance things out. Father disapproved of his brother-in-law just as much as Mother objected to Mrs. Murdoch, so this made things even. Uncle Tony was far too unconventional for Father. He'd never held a steady job or married, and rumours circulated about his preference for men. Moreover, his politics embarrassed Father, especially in front of people like the Murdochs, who shared Father's conservative views. Uncle Tony was not a Communist Party member, his taste in clothes, art and wine precluded this, but he sympathised with the left. Father also resented his brother-in-law for having had the opportunities that he would have wished for, being born upper class and achieving a place at Cambridge. To make matters worse, Tony had, in Father's eyes, squandered his opportunities by dropping out of Cambridge and associating with people Father deemed socially and politically unsavoury. The Murdochs arrived on time, but Uncle Tony missed his train, and because Father wouldn't go back to the station, Jane drove to fetch him instead. Father had wanted to start the meal without Uncle Tony, but Madame Pagnol wouldn't hear of it. To Father's chagrin, Madame Pagnol exerted considerable authority over the home in France. She'd been chef to the Hume family since Mother and Uncle Tony were children, and when it came to meals, she was boss. She had a voice like thunder and a girth to match, and nobody ordered her around, least of all Father. Because Madame Pagnol had a soft spot for her little Antoine, she had planned the menu around Uncle Tony's favourite dishes, foie gras, coquille Saint-Jacques with black truffles, and the famous Pagnol tarte aux poires. When Uncle Tony finally arrived, he sat next to Jane, wisely paying no attention to Father, scowling at the far end of the table. Oh la la, Vanessa thought to herself. At least Jane looked happy, which made for a change. She still didn't say much in large groups, but there was a quiet confidence about her that Vanessa sensed, even when Jane wasn't talking. Vietnam was a topic of conversation, and Uncle Tony had plenty to say as he described his participation in recent anti-nuclear testing demonstrations. Not surprisingly, Father grunted his disapproval, but that didn't stop Vanessa from asking questions. Did Uncle Tony think America would be forced to withdraw their troops? She tried several times to ask the question, but, true to form, Nancy Murdoch, in collusion with Father, kept interrupting. Mr. Murdoch said nothing when his wife talked, either because he was too intimidated, or, more likely, because his wife embarrassed him. "Did you know that the number of black children in English children's homes is on the rise?" Nancy spoke in her affected, high-pitched voice, making no attempt to link her comment to anything said before. "And did you know that the brown children are the hardest to find families for?" "And did you know," Vanessa thought, watching Nancy babble, "that you have chunks of green spinach in between your teeth?" "And why is that?" Jane asked, the only one kind enough to indulge the woman in conversation. "Well," Nancy paused, "many parents won't take the brown ones for fear of what others might think. If the children are properly black, of course, there's no mistaking the mothers, but with the brown ones, people gossip. You know, few women want to be mistaken as mothers of—" Nancy paused again. "Mulattoes," she whispered, as though the word itself were poison. "That's just stupid," Vanessa scoffed. "Fromage," Madame Pagnol announced, arriving with another course. "Well, you can't blame them, Nessa," Father said, covering his nose as he pushed away the plate of Munster and Camembert. "Why not?" "People will think it's rape," Nancy answered, peering dubiously at the cheeses and opting for the date garnish. "Oh, that's ridiculous," Vanessa insisted. "I think Nessa's right," Uncle Tony added. "There are probably very few rapes. It's just people being too racist to deal with the results of their actions, or should we say, passions." "Precisely," Vanessa nodded. Eh ben, c'est bien, Madame Pagnol exclaimed, happy to find dents in her cheese. She had returned with a salad.
Well, you can't blame the English for being racist, you know. Mrs. Murdoch raised her palms meekly. The blacks are just as bad, if not worse. They reject them too. It's terribly distressing, but at the end of the day, we just need to find these little dearies a home, don't we?
So, Nessa darling, how is Oxford these days? Uncle Tony asked, changing the subject. Vanessa smiled, knowing that her uncle felt the same way as she did about Nancy Murdoch. Everything about the woman was irritating, her high-pitched voice, her supercilious tone, her feigned generosity, and the green in her teeth. She's having a jolly time, aren't you, Vanessa? Father answered. And what's this I hear about you writing for the Oxford newspapers? Uncle Tony asked. Oh, it's just a few things for Isis.
So you're a writer now, Nancy interrupted. How delightful. I've always thought it a super career for a woman, something to pass the time when you're raising children. You must also learn to type, darling.
Vanessa rolled her eyes. Vanessa's very interested in Africa, Mother added. She supports all their independence movements. Well, she might not be supporting them for long. Wait and see if they last, Father added dryly.
Jonathan, please.
Mother tapped the side of her glass again. Vanessa shook her head, wishing she could disappear from it all. Mother had been doing so well, but now, with Nancy's stupid comments and Father's equally stupid remarks, Mother was back to her drink, and it was only going to get worse. So tell me more, darling, Uncle Tony urged, offering cigars. Cuban, Lizzie? Mother declined. Jane? He added with a wink. Vanessa watched with curiosity as Jane accepted. So this was the new Jane. Tell me more about your writing, Nessa, Uncle Tony probed. Vanessa mentioned a few of her articles, including the one she was most proud of, a critique of American foreign policy as it pertained to their previous discussion. Rather silly if you ask me, Father mumbled. Well, luckily nobody's asking you, Mother replied, pouring another brandy as Madame Pagnol entered with the prized tarte aux poires. Vanessa has lots of foreign friends up at Oxford, especially from our colonies, Father continued, ignoring the tart that brought a round of applause from everyone else. Ex-colonies, you mean, Vanessa said. And Madame Pagnol, this is délicieux, fantastique. Oh, bien se nourrir pour bien se porter, Madame Pagnol winked. Ah, Giselle, Uncle Tony was the only one who could call Madame Pagnol by her first name. What do you think? Should Vanessa become a writer? Il faut d'abord qu'elle apprenne faire la cuisine. And why must I learn to cook? Parce que, Madame Pagnol paused, looking mischievously in Father's direction. Savoir faire la cuisine, c'est savoir contrôler les hommes. You cook, you control the men, she said, laughing at her own translation. We've had quite the foreign lot to visit, haven't we, Elizabeth? Father persisted. One feels rather obliged to show them the world. It's very civilizing for them, really. For many years, Vanessa thought that this was just Father's way of speaking, that he spoke condescendingly on most subjects without really meaning to. This was also how Mother explained it. But Vanessa no longer believed it. Didn't we meet some of them at the Christmas party? Mr. Murdoch asked. There were Indians, I believe, and a coloured man, wasn't there? Yes, that's right, Father replied. They must make special concessions for them to get into Oxford these days. They're still bright for Africans, mind you, future ministers and leaders of their countries. Oh, really, Jonathan, don't be so stupid, Uncle Tony replied. Well, I'm simply telling you what I observed at Oxford, Father continued. I hardly think a summer course counts as having gone to Oxford. Please, Mother pleaded. Well, some of us did go to Oxbridge, Tony insisted. And dropped out, Father added. Will you two stop it? Mother snapped. As I was saying, Father continued, we've had quite the foreign lot to visit, including the Nigerian chappie at Balliol. Now, there's a bright fellow for you, with good manners, reading PPE at Balliol, and he's Yoruba, of course. They've always been the most straightforward with the Hausa. You can never tell what they're up to, and the Igbos are always so sly. Oh, Daddy, you can't say things like that. Why ever not? They would tell you the same thing if you asked. Actually, I recall that chap looking rather like your gardener in Joss, Nancy remarked. A lovely young man. Why ever did you sack him? Because he was an idiot, Father barked. Oh dear, I always thought... Nancy, Mr. Murdoch glared at his wife, cutting her off mid-sentence. Jonathan's the idiot, Mother muttered, filling her glass without looking as she poured. Oh, for Christ's sake, Mum. So tell me, Nessa, Uncle Tony winked again at Jane. Are Oxford women still being treated as second-class citizens, and what about... Jonathan's the bloody idiot, Mother slurred. You're the one that looks idiotic, Elizabeth, Father answered. You and your beloved gardener. Did he know you're a drunk? Oh, I say, Nancy exclaimed. You say what? Mother shouted, glaring at Nancy and then at Father. Don't you remember the gardener's name? He had a name, you know. She banged the bottle back on the table. Mother, Vanessa pleaded, but she was already up and marching unsteadily but determinedly out of the room. Well, that was quite some drama for one night, Jane remarked as she and Vanessa went to their room after helping Madame Pagnol clear the plates. I can't believe my mother, Vanessa muttered. You shouldn't let it bother you, Nessa. Nancy's enough to drive anyone to drink. Now listen, you've got to tell me, who is this very nice chap from Balliol? She asked, imitating Father's accent. Oh, shut up, Vanessa tossed a pillow at her. So let's have a look at that photo again. Jane hopped from her bed to Vanessa's. Why? Because I want to see it, silly. Come on. Not all of us are lucky enough to have handsome boyfriends or even a boyfriend at all. And have you done it yet? Done what? You know. Jane cocked her head and raised her eyebrows. Oh, don't be such a prude. I'm not being a prude. Vanessa picked up the fallen pillow and lobbed it back at Jane. Yes, you are. No, I'm not. Promise then to tell me all about him and I'll tell you a secret. What secret? Promise? What secret? Promise? Okay, yes, promise. Vanessa nodded impatiently. Me and your uncle did it on the way back from the station. Did what? Had sex. You what? You're so dramatic, Nessa. This isn't Victorian England. It's the 1960s, for God's sakes. You and your Uncle Tony. But he's not that way inclined. Vanessa stammered. Inclined? Oh, yes, he is. Oh, God, Jane, is this serious? No. Tony's far too old for me, though I must say that older men really have that touch, the way he... Jane, I don't want to know. Well, if you don't want to hear, tell me about your boyfriend. What do you two get up to? Obviously nothing compared to you. So? Jane rolled her hands in continuous circles for more detail. It's not like you to be at a loss for words, Nessa. Oh, Jane, what does this mean for you and Tony? It doesn't mean anything. Read some Freud. It's just sex. Speaking of which, is it really true what they say about size? I have no idea. And with that, Vanessa pushed Jane off the bed. Okay, so what did your parents think of him? Jane asked, jumping back. Come on, Nessa, don't be so cross. Well, they like him. But how about what Nattering Nancy was saying? Wouldn't they worry about the way people would view your children? It's just a skin colour, Jane. I know that, and you know that, but your father's not exactly the most liberal of thinkers. Liberal enough to marry against his parents' wishes. Anyway, who said anything about marriage? Of course you will, Jane thumped the mattress with her hand. Oh, Nessa, you're smitten, it's obvious. I can already imagine you married to him. He'll be the next Nigerian Prime Minister, and you'll be living over there in one of those fancy mansions with servants fanning you and bringing you food. You'll have all those lovely brown children running around. The local papers will carry the headlines. Prime Minister... What's his name again? Tayo Ajayi, Vanessa smiled, forgetting her annoyance. Prime Minister Ajayi and his wife Vanessa Ajayi, Jane announced, wriggling under the covers. Visited by Dr. Jane and somebody so-and-so. Sounds good, n'est-ce pas? More likely Professor Ajayi than Prime Minister Ajayi. He wants to teach. Oh, well, that's a shame. Never mind. I'm sure he'll be somebody important one day. A chancellor, perhaps. And won't that be nobby? She rolled onto her side. Hey, she rolled back. Let's go see Jean-Pierre and Olivier tomorrow. They ought to be back by now. Vanessa shrugged. She wasn't as excited about them as she was a year ago. It was Tayo she thought of now. Perhaps Jane was right. Perhaps he would be a chancellor one day. Perhaps she'd be the professor. Or perhaps she'd write for one of the national newspapers. They would live on campus or in the city maybe. She imagined shopping in the outdoor markets and at weekends enjoying long walks by the beach and nights of music and dance. She wondered what Tayo was doing at that moment without her. Hopefully he wasn't meeting women. She didn't like it when he flirted with other women and especially with coloured women. It didn't help that whenever Christine's name was mentioned he became withdrawn, and when she remarked on it he accused her of not understanding his culture, which made her cross. She was doing all that she could to understand. So, let's just say, just hypothetically, if I married Tayo, would you definitely come to Africa and visit me? Vanessa peered over Jane's shoulder. Jane? She whispered, but Jane was fast asleep. Chapter 12. Le Carlat, Saint-Jean-Ferrat, France, 18th June, 1965. Dear Tayo, how could you possibly think that you were boring me? I want lots of letters, beaucoup de lettres, and even longer ones, but make them less polite and formal next time. Tell me how much you've been missing me, and how much you dream of me, otherwise I will start to wonder what you're up to with those northern lasses. I do wish you were here. The weather is beautifully warm, just as you'd like it, and we spend most of our time outdoors. Most days I cycle to the nearby town of Beaulieu, to the outdoor market, where we buy fresh breads, pastries, and smelly cheeses. I know you're not a fan, but just wait till you come. In the afternoons I visit the local cafe and I sip my café au lait while fending off all the Frenchmen, ha-ha, and then I gaze across the Côte d'Azur and dream of you. And in between these dreams, I've been reading the books you suggested, starting with Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart and No Longer at Ease. I enjoyed them and think I might review one for ISIS, so you'll have to help me. Achebe has such a wonderful way with descriptions. Do you remember the scene in No Longer at Ease when, in the words of Obi, Achebe describes the dancing women with waists swivelling as effortlessly as oiled ball bearings? What a wonderful image. I'm looking forward to discussing the writing with you when I see you. I only wish that his stories were not so tragic, but perhaps the tragedy highlights the dilemmas of post-independence, which brings me to your Perham review. I feel so flattered you sent it to me and asked for my opinion. What do I think? I think it's fab. I don't have much to add except that reading Achebe made me wonder whether it might be worth mentioning somewhere in the piece that Africans themselves are sensitive to the difficulties inherent in the new post-colonial world. I also have a few more minor suggestions. First, for the purposes of Spear magazine and its West African readership, I think you should provide background information on Dame Marjorie. Mention that she's an Oxford Don and that her family has a lengthy history within the service. By the way, Father says that Perham was a royal pain for the colonial service and much more provocative than we give her credit for. Also, I think you should consider structuring the review more tightly around what I see as your principal criticisms of Perham's work. 1. An underestimation, dismal almost, of Africa's pre-colonial history, a little like Trevor Roper. 2. Failure to acknowledge the potential of Africa's new leaders, e.g. Senghor, Kenyatta and Nkrumah. 3. The belief that independence was granted too swiftly to African states. Here is where you might reference Achebe. I've also corrected 1 or 2 grammatical errors. You'll see them marked in red. Well done, and très bien. Reading your review has made me think more about what we discussed vis-à-vis my own journalistic writing. Perhaps I should write more, and especially this year with no exams. If ISIS is still looking for an arts reviewer, I'll apply for the position, and if I'm accepted, be prepared to accompany me to films, exhibitions and jazz. I'm off to lunch now with Jane and some French men, so you'd better write soon. Loads of love, kisses, hugs, and anything else you dare to imagine. Nessa. 6 Aberdeen Road, Bradford, 30th June, 1965. My dear Vanessa, thank you so much for your letter, and I'm glad to hear that you're having such a splendid holiday. Now, as for those men at the cafe, I hear that French men can be quite romantic, so don't let them woo you with their sweet talk and philosophy. Remind them that you have a sweeter man waiting for you in England, and in the meantime, I will do my best to ward off all those northern lasses. So here I am, in Tunde's small but cosy house, with the evenings to myself, when Yusuf and Tunde are working. I realize more than ever how fortunate I've been to receive a Balliol scholarship. Most African students spend long hours working to make ends meet, and I wonder how they manage to pass their exams with so little sleep. Tunde works from 10 at night until 6 in the morning at the local bakery. Yusuf also takes night shifts at the hospital. There are apparently many Africans working as orderlies, and most are assigned to the geriatric ward, where others are not so willing to work. I find this sad because in Africa, old people are respected, and their families look after them. We never put old people in homes, so maybe that's why Nigerians always staff these geriatric wards. And I hear that the matron also favours Africans because she used to live in Nigeria as a missionary. Northern England seems very different from the south. People are friendlier on the whole, although one does occasionally see these signs: no dogs, no Irish, no coloureds. It's disappointing, but the Africans here don't seem too bothered. They know they are here for just a limited time. Yesterday, I accompanied Tunde to the bakery. One of his mates was sick, and I offered to take his place loading bread. It was an interesting experience, and it gave me some insight into Bradford society. I found that the Pakistanis and Indians are the ones working the ovens, which is the hardest and messiest job because the ovens get very hot and dirty. Many of them don't speak English, but they have a translator by the name of Samir who loves to talk politics. The Africans, mainly students, all of whom speak English, have the slightly better task of loading freshly baked breads, scones and tea cakes onto the carts and wheeling them to the loading zone. This, by the way, was my job. The least strenuous job of all, which is packing the goods and loading them onto the dispatch trucks, is reserved for the English. So that's the pecking order. Pakistanis and Indians on the bottom, Africans in the middle, and English on top. Last week, I visited York. Have you been? It's full of history, and I enjoyed walking along the old Roman wall. There's also the Minster, which is magnificent. At times, when I see things like this, I wish we had similar marks of history in West Africa. There's so few visual reminders of our past that remain. This is when I realize how important it is for us to record and preserve our oral histories for future generations. But by now, you must be tired of this letter that has become longer than intended, although you did ask for a long letter. Oh, and I mustn't forget to thank you so much for reading my Perham review and providing the helpful feedback. I've entitled it, An African's Response, Reflections on Dame Marjorie Perham's Colonial Reckoning. What do you think? I miss you dreadfully, Vanessa, but I'll sign off for now and await your reply. Kind regards to your mother and father. Yours truly, Tayo. Chapter 13. Tayo's cousin Tunde lived in a small terraced house close to St. Luke's Hospital. It was the sort of house known as a 2-up, 2-down, with a living room and kitchen on the bottom floor, 2 bedrooms upstairs and a toilet outside. Bathing was done in a tin bath in the kitchen or at the public baths down the road. Tunde had one of the upstairs bedrooms, which he now shared with Tayo, and Yusuf used the downstairs living room as his bedroom. Normally, there were 2 other Nigerians who shared the second bedroom, but as they were out of town on this particular weekend, Yusuf and Tunde decided they would have a party. Yusuf and Tayo spent the afternoon clearing out Yusuf's room for space to dance. They took the mattress away and lifted the wardrobe into the hallway so that the room looked like the lounge it was designed to be. As they worked, Yusuf muttered about how unfortunate it was that Tunde refused to serve drinks at the party. He blamed this on Tunde's new church. Tayo said nothing, but he'd also noticed that his cousin seemed a little overzealous at times. Tayo put away the carpet sweeper and began to help Yusuf sort through the mess of records strewn across the floor. He thinks parties are ungodly and worries about drinking and smoking. Yusuf added. What's drinking and smoking? Tayo laughed. Have you become a Yorkshire man, Yusuf? Yorkshire Yusuf, Yoruba Yusuf, Yankee Yusuf, pick anyone you like as long as it gets me the girls, Yusuf laughed. It's just too bad there's going to be no boozing tonight, he sighed. Hey, what's wrong with Cilla Black? Yusuf grabbed the vinyl that Tayo had tossed to one side. What do you have against her? The English girls love it, you know, and yours truly, Yusuf paused to take a bow, aims to please the ladies. Anyway, what do you people listen to at Oxford? Beethoven? Opera? Ah, come on, we have all the latest stuff. And you drink too, Abi. Don't tell me you don't drink at that university of yours. Of course we drink. Now where's the high life? Hold your horses, Oxford man. Yusuf hopped over discarded records. Here, I keep them in a special place. Dairo, Bobby Benson, Sonny Ade, just name it, I have it. He fanned out the sleeves between his arms in demonstration, causing all the records to fall on the floor. Ah, shit, he laughed, bending down to gather them up and inspect each for damage. Arinze, Yusuf muttered, peering at a name on one of the sleeves. Hey, wasn't there an Arinze at Oxford? Tayo nodded, hoping Yusuf would leave it at that. It was that Igbo woman, wasn't it? Someone said it was suicide and not an illness, like they were saying in the papers. Who said that? Tayo frowned. Look, my friend, I don't know. The last thing he wanted was for Yusuf to ask if he knew Christine, so he steered the conversation back to Yusuf. Was Yusuf intending to marry his current girlfriend? Oh no, Yusuf exclaimed. But don't get me wrong, I do like Joyce. We dance, we go to the pictures, we have a good time. There's naught wrong with an English lass for a bit of fun, but marriage, that's different. When I'm ready, my friend, is gonna be 100% Nigerian woman. Yes, most definitely, and a good northern Muslim one too. I don't care what Spear is saying these days about Nigerian women. The fact remains that at the end of the day, and in the middle of the night, Yusuf winked, they are the best. Tayo shook his head impatiently. No, listen to me, Tayo. Nigerian women know how to care for us, how to cook our food, and maintain the culture for our children. That's right. But the English women, them no fit to that. Besides, have you seen English women after they reach 30 years old? What do you mean? Tayo, come on, don't tell me you don't know what I mean. Habba, after they pass 30, they look old. No, tell me, say you know they see them. They get all those wrinkles. Yusuf scrunched up his face in demonstration. And their bottoms just go flat like ironing board, whereas our African women remain young and smooth and curvy, man. Tayo laughed as Yusuf dusted the surface of his cheeks with his fingertips in exaggerated gestures. But Nigerian women are no use for girlfriends. I no fit take Nigerian girlfriend, Yusuf insisted, eyeing himself in the mirror above the mantelpiece. Why? Because it's too much palaver. Wallahi. Them just they go talk wedding. But why women? That's where man fit relax well. Yusuf grabbed his crotch. You're foolish, Tayo laughed in spite of himself. But it's true. Don't tell me you don't know white women. Of course, but I don't agree with your stereotypes. What stereotypes? White is nice for us, black is nice for them. It's exotic, that's all. Pure 100% exoticism. Okay, maybe the first time with a white woman is something new. Well, just because it's new, but after that there's no difference. You love the woman for who she is, not for her colour, Tayo insisted, recalling a similar but less jocular debate with Christine. Tayo, my friend, you're fooling yourself. Why do you think they like you? Because you get Oxford mind? And no tell me say you no think white women be cool like Expressway, and you treat them different to African one now. No be so? I don't. Anyway, as for me, I'm gonna marry a Nigerian. It's my patriotic duty. And then if I want, I can even marry up to 4. Yes, now. And they're gonna be natural ones too. No makeup, no wigs, no miniskirts. Habba, Yusuf, you won't go back for caveman age. Look, I have the right to marry 4 women. And it's the same for you. Yusuf stepped away from the mirror. Look at your father. How many wives he get? Plenty, no be so? And he's happy. His wives are happy. That's his business. So you go marry English woman, Yusuf laughed. This Oxford don't brainwash you, ba? And what about Master Tunde? What about what? Tunde asked, standing in the doorway with an armful of paper cups and plates. How many wives you go take, an English or Nigerian? What do you mean, how many? 1, of course, Tunde replied. The Bible says a man shall take 1 wife. Genesis chapter 2, verse 24. Uh-oh, here we go, Tayo thought, exchanging a knowing look with Yusuf, the Lord spare us. But Tunde had already launched into scripture. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one. It doesn't matter what nationality, as long as my wife is born again. But what about Abraham and Moses? Yusuf asked. Didn't they have plenty of wives? Only 2, and that was in Old Testament times. Tunde squeezed the paper plates hard against his chest. And what's wrong with Old Testament? Yusuf persisted. Tunde stood in bewildered silence, gazing at the now squashed stack of cups in his arms, so that Tayo felt obliged to intervene on his cousin's behalf. Yusuf, those were in the times before Jesus Christ. Things have changed since then. Don't you even know that? Ah, that's your Christianity, Yusuf laughed. Now too confusing for me. Anyway, Tayo, what about the French lady writing to you? You didn't read it to us. Who is she now? Tunde sighed and left the room. Don't vex him with his religion, Tayo whispered, punching Yusuf on the arm. And she's not French, she's just a good friend whom I've accompanied to... Good friend, girlfriend, you mean, Yusuf laughed, striking back with a jab in the ribs. Don't use those fancy Oxford words with us. Accompanied, what does that mean? Accompanied to the sack? Anyway, I'm off to change my shirt, and don't accompany me, oh. Alone in the room, Tayo straightened the records that still lay scattered across the floor. Such a joker, Tayo mumbled to himself, thinking of Yusuf's nonsense talk. Yet perhaps he was right about some things, if not about race. Tayo reasoned that if he behaved differently with Vanessa than he did with Christine, it was because they came from different cultures. And the same thing would apply to any other woman from a different culture, any woman not from Nigeria. But how did Vanessa see things? Were Yusuf and Christine right to say that English women only liked black men because they were exotic? Though why was he troubling his head with all of this? Tonight he wanted to have a good time, dance and enjoy some sweet vibes. Joyce and her two friends, Norma and Jean, were the first to arrive. They wore matching pink miniskirts with high heels, which reminded Tayo of the three Supremes, except that these Supremes were white and carried wicker baskets of food instead of tambourines. Now we're ready to party, Yusuf announced, clapping his hands while Tayo saw to the women's baskets and carried them to the kitchen. Mambo, Tunde called from upstairs.
Oh, what language was that? Joyce asked. Is it Nigerian?
Yes, Tayo smiled.
I've never heard you speak it.
Joyce turned accusingly to Yusuf, but Yusuf didn't hear. He was too busy peering into the baskets. Custard pie, Scotch egg, Yusuf mumbled. Cheese straws, Swiss roll, treacle tart. Aha, now here's what I'm talking about. Sausage rolls. Yusuf, Joyce shouted. Bloody hell, woman. Yusuf jumped, one hand hovering guiltily over the sausages. Why are you shouting?
I said I haven't heard you speak Nigerian.
Nobody speaks Nigerian, you daft thing, Yusuf laughed. She waited for an explanation, but none was forthcoming. The boys from the bakery had arrived, and she'd lost Yusuf's attention to Samir, who wanted to know what they were celebrating. It's a party for my cousin, Tunde explained, and also in honour of Gambia's independence. But you chaps aren't from Gambia. Yeah, but we're all African, Yusuf replied, ushering people back into the front room. And India's our inspiration, Tayo added. We're hoping for an African Nehru. Well, stop hoping, Samir laughed. Why? Only wish for your Nehru if you want trouble. You want religious divisions? You want poor people to remain poor and for power to stay within one family? If that's what you're after, then by all means pray for a Nehru. No disrespect to the deceased, of course. Oh, come on, Tayo raised his voice against Samir's. Look, the man might have failed a little with the economy, but you can't accuse him of siding with landed interests or for condoning religious differences. Read his autobiography, and you'll see what he has to say on religion. Why should I read his stuff when I lived it? And you think his daughter will make things better? Aren't women always cleverer than men? Tayo turned to Joyce, who'd been leaning against the kitchen worktop listening. The others were busy arranging food, but Joyce seemed to be interested in what they were discussing.
So why doesn't Yusuf speak Nigerian too? She asked, picking up a knife and a cake.
Tayo glanced at Samir and then back to Joyce. Where was Yusuf when needed? There are many languages in Nigeria, Joyce. Yusuf speaks Hausa, and I speak Yoruba.
How many languages?
Joyce asked, with serrated knife now poised above the large Victoria sandwich. Hundreds.
Crikey!
She stabbed the cake and sliced it rapidly into triangular pieces.
Yusuf never told me that. He's taking me to Africa after we're married.
I see, Tayo nodded, wondering just how many girls Yusuf had promised that to. Samir had left them talking and the music had started. Come, ladies, I think you've worked hard enough. Let's join the party. The front room was crowded, and Tayo recognized only a few people. Some were from the bakery, others from the hospital, and Mr. and Mrs. Winter came from across the road. Tunde was introducing Tayo to others when Yusuf announced the first dance. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, he boomed, welcome to our party and let's see some dancing. The first is ladies' choice, and please don't all rush for our Oxford gentlemen, because there are others in the room too. Yorkshire men, Yoruba men, Yankee men, you name it, Yusuf laughed, winking at Tayo. Soon, Tayo was twisting and jiving to Sam Cooke's Saturday Night and enjoying the attention of several women. Boos appeared from somewhere, contrary to Yusuf's prediction, and the dancing improved. Yusuf was demonstrating the wild jitterbug better than Elvis and then showing all the girls how to do the twist to high life. He concocted fancy Hausa names for the two-step and the cha-cha-cha and called himself a cool cat after Victor Olaya's band. It made the girls laugh, and soon the whole room was spinning from side to side, arms in the air, skirts swishing back and forth. Girls reached for Tayo's hand, he held one and then another, until at some point in the evening he found himself standing in the hallway with one hand pressed against the wall and the other wrapped around a woman's waist. Easy does it, Yusuf winked, brushing past them to open the front door, and then there was a shout and a thud, and something struck hard against Tayo's jaw. Don't you bloody touch my sister, someone swore. Tayo spun around and caught the next punch, just as Samir arrived to intervene. You bastard, Tayo swore, tasting blood. Who said bastard? I'm going to teach you a lesson, just you wait. Yeah, Tayo shouted. Why don't you ask your sister who started it? But by then the girl was nowhere to be seen. Hey, what's all this nonsense? Shouted Tunde. Someone had switched off the music and people had begun to leave, squeezing past and muttering hurried goodbyes. "Time you niggers hop back to your jungles," the man sneered. "Shut your bloody mouth. You want to fight? Come," Tayo beckoned, stepping forward, but Yusuf blocked his path. The man kept shouting as others pulled him back and pushed him outside. "Yeah, go ahead and call the police if you like," Tayo jeered, pushing Tunde out of his way. "Look at that," Tayo pointed angrily at his jaw. "This bloody idiot just walks in and starts the fight. Let him call the police." "Nobody's calling the police," Tunde said, angrily picking things up. "Let's tidy this mess. Party over." "And what are you looking so pleased about?" Tayo glared at Yusuf, standing in the hallway, grinning. "You still want to marry an English girl?" Yusuf laughed. Tayo swore at Yusuf as he fingered the swelling on his lip, and was about to swear again when he realized Yusuf had stopped grinning and was waving for him to run. The front door was open, and the man was back with friends. "Which one is it?" someone shouted. "That's him. Scared, are we?" he sneered. "Tayo!" Yusuf shouted, desperate this time. "Who's scared of you?" Tayo looked the man in the eye, ignoring his friends and the bottles that emerged from coat pockets. He braced himself as one of the men rushed him. A fist rammed into his stomach, taking the air from his body, and he fell against someone's foot. Yusuf and Tunde were shouting as he clasped his head, and then silence. "What's going on?" Tayo gasped, opening his eyes to see men in uniform. "Get up!" the policeman shouted. "All of you, down to the station for questioning." Tayo closed his eyes and winced in pain. Tunde and Yusuf were trying in vain to convince the police that this was their house, but the thugs had fled, and now they were being arrested. On the way to the station, Yusuf sat silently, his body rigid with anger, while Tunde tried explaining to the police that it was not their fault. At the same time, Tayo was telling Tunde to shut up, but he wouldn't listen, so by the time they arrived, Yusuf and Tayo were ready to fight both the police and Tunde. "Look, this is ridiculous," Tayo shouted. "I'm a policeman's son, and I know we have rights." "What rights?" one of the officers asked, looking bemused. "And no use asking for a superintendent. It's just the four of us." "We do have rights," Tayo insisted, trying to gesture with his hands, forgetting that they were handcuffed. "You can't do this. I'm a student at Oxford, and I know people who would make your life miserable." "Do you now?" the officer laughed, grabbing him by the arm and pushing him into an empty cell. "You racist pigs, the whole lot of you," Yusuf shouted. At first, Tayo was too angry to be worried about what would happen next, but as the hours passed, fear crept into his mind with the realization that he had no control over events. Here they were, 3 black men locked up in separate cells. It didn't matter what sort of families they came from. It didn't matter that they were educated. It didn't even matter that he studied at Oxford. Tayo stared at his empty cell, imagining various morbid scenarios and then trying to think of a solution. It would have calmed him to know that Mr. and Mrs. Winter had seen what had happened and would come to the station the following morning, but Tayo had no way of knowing this at the time. Chapter 14. When Tayo returned to Oxford, he decided not to tell anyone about the fight in Bradford. He definitely hadn't wanted to tell Vanessa, but she'd noticed his chipped tooth, which left him little choice but to tell her something. So he'd said that a fight had started between 2 drunkards, and he, acting as Sir Galahad, had intervened. But Vanessa seemed to have a sixth sense, which was the only explanation Tayo could find for why she'd started nagging him so much. Sometimes it was about the way he spoke to other women. Sometimes it was about his football. At other times it was his social life. She complained that they weren't spending enough time together, yet, he wondered, if she'd really wanted to spend time with him, why hadn't she wanted to come to this wedding? Yes, she would be coming to join him later, but that wasn't the point. She'd also told him that his Nigerian friends made her feel excluded, but he wondered how she could possibly feel excluded in her own country. "Morning," someone said, drawing Tayo from his thoughts as he sat awaiting the arrival of the bride. "Good morning." Tayo smiled at the young woman who sat next to him in the pew. He was about to introduce himself properly when she turned to face the altar and made a sign of the cross. She then knelt on a prayer cushion in such a way that her skirt rose above the back of her knees, revealing a shapely pair of legs. Tayo closed his eyes and listened for some moments to the organ music, thinking that maybe he ought to pray too. He looked to the altar and the sanctuary where the choir boys sat behind the lectern, looking angelic in their white robes and ruffled collars. The church was otherwise dark and musty, until an unexpected ray of sunlight pierced the stained glass windows. Tayo smiled, thinking of the sunshine coming all the way from the groom's home in Kano and bursting through the English clouds to make a guest appearance in Finchley, North London, for today's service. Unfortunately, this sun was a frustrating winter one, bringing plenty of light but no heat. Tayo looked again at the woman next to him and contemplated conversation, but the organ music stopped and everyone's eyes turned towards the back of the church. They all watched in anticipation, but the organist had not stopped to signal anything in particular and soon resumed another piece. As Tayo listened, he felt a sense of relief and awe. Relief because it was not him having to take the vows, and awe at the solemnity of such occasions. He reflected that this wedding was the most surprising of any he'd attended, and surmised that the bride must have fallen pregnant. This, at least, would explain the speed of arranging it, but there was no one to confirm his hypothesis. Tunde was not around, and the only other person to ask was Yusuf himself, who now stood at the front of the church, smiling broadly. Tayo stared at the groom, looking for signs of nervousness. There were no obvious indicators, but Tayo knew that beneath the smiles Yusuf was anxious. Sitting in the congregation on the bridegroom's side were many of Yusuf's Bradford friends, and on the bride's side were women dressed in the traditional Nigerian wedding lace. It surprised Tayo to see that Joyce had so many Nigerian guests at the wedding, when he would have expected English people. A hush then fell across the congregation, and everyone turned again to face the back of the church. This time the veiled bride appeared like an angel beneath the arch of the church doors. Tayo looked again, squinting to make sure he wasn't seeing things. The bride was black. He glanced at the service sheet and reread the names: Yusuf Abubakar and Joy Williams. Joy, not Joyce. Tayo looked around to see if anyone else was shocked, but nothing showed on people's faces. Who was this Joy? Williams was not a typical Nigerian name, but this was less puzzling to Tayo than the fact that he couldn't recall meeting anyone named Joy when he was in Bradford just a few months earlier, and yet Yusuf was smiling broadly as though he'd been planning this day for years. Vows were taken, rings exchanged, and nobody stood up to give reason or just impediment why the two should not be joined together in holy matrimony. And so it was that Yusuf, the ladies' man, became a married man. The organ started its wedding march, and the happy couple walked down the aisle, followed by the congregation. Outside, people threw confetti as the church bells rang out. Tayo stood watching, amused by the cameraman who dashed about trying to capture each joyful expression, and for a moment he could have been back in Nigeria. He had missed this, the fancy ways women tied their geles, and the starchy rustle of wrappers and agbadas. He'd also missed the smiles, the loud, imperious voices and perspiration. Of course, now that the sun was out, the reception would start late, but it was bound to have started late anyway. He wondered what the reception would be like, remembering the chaos of those back home, where he and his brothers would compete to maneuver their way into the VIP queue. He was laughing to himself about his childhood antics when someone tapped him on the shoulder. "Vanessa!" There she was, dressed in the fine lace wrapper and buba that they'd borrowed from a friend in Cowley. The pale blue material, with its silver thread, sparkled against her skin and drew attention to her smiling eyes. Then it dawned on him that he was in trouble. How was he going to tell her that the bride was not who he thought it was? And especially after all that he'd been saying about how common it was for Nigerians to marry Europeans. He wouldn't be able to blame his mistake on the fact that he didn't know Yusuf that well either, because Vanessa was under the impression that Yusuf was a close friend. That had been his line for being so upset over her decision to skip the service. There was no other way but to tell Vanessa that he'd made a mistake. "What?" Vanessa exclaimed. "I know, I can't believe it myself. I must have misread the invitation. I thought it was Joyce, but it's Joy, so maybe the relationship with Joyce wasn't so serious after all." "Not serious? But you said Joyce was his girlfriend." "She was, but shh, please," he begged, aware of how close they stood to the bride's family. "Come," he said, urging her in the direction of the church hall and the reception where they could talk with greater privacy. The band had started, and men dressed in brilliant white agbadas waved them into a noisy room smelling of fried rice. Wall heaters turned to maximum, and glowing orange made the hall feel too hot, even for Tayo. "You look beautiful," he whispered, as they found their way to a table. He said it again, but still she didn't answer. "Come," he said, taking Vanessa's arm. "You should have seen people in church. Lots of people looked shocked when the bride arrived. We're bound to find out what happened, sooner or later." Vanessa still said nothing, but by now the bride and groom had arrived, and people had started showering the couple with pound notes. "It's a tradition," Tayo explained, "to bless the couple by placing money on them. Come, let's make our contribution." He stretched his hands through the huddle of well-wishers and tucked 2-pound notes into Joy's head tie that had become so laden with notes that a few fluttered to the floor. "Congratulations, old chap," Tayo patted Yusuf on the shoulder. "Now you've finally met the woman I've been telling you about," Yusuf beamed. "My Yoruba queen." "What woman?" But of course, Tayo couldn't say this in front of the bride. Instead, he nodded enthusiastically and greeted the married couple. "It's very odd," Tayo whispered to Vanessa. "What were you saying to the bride?" "I was wishing her the best from us, a happy and blessed marriage." Ire a Kario, literally translated, means, "May the blessings of this joyful occasion be spread among your still unmarried friends." Pleased, he slipped his hand beneath the tablecloth and tried running his fingers down Vanessa's skirt, but she stopped him with an angry movement. "Okay," he relented, surprised by her reaction, but others were joining their table, so nothing more was said. Food was served: jollof, amala, goat stew, egusi, and many more dishes that Vanessa would normally have asked Tayo about. But now she had her back turned, chatting to others. He did the same, and then later pretended to be listening to the speeches. He'd expected her to be surprised by the new bride and maybe a little cross with him for making the mistake, but not angry. Not this angry. "What's wrong, Vanessa?" he whispered, trying to cajole her out of her silence. But she wouldn't be drawn, so that when the orations eventually ended and the dancing began, Tayo didn't bother to ask her to join him. He didn't feel like dancing on his own, but he would be damned if he was just going to sit there and not at least appear to be enjoying the music. A part of him considered asking the pretty woman who had sat next to him in church, but he couldn't. No matter how annoyed he was with Vanessa, he would never do something like that. He moved closer to Vanessa and let his arms swing loosely as he sang along to the words of Sonia De. But even this did not bring a smile to her face. She wasn't even looking at him. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the far end of the room. A woman was flinging plates off a table, and Tayo's heart sank when he looked over and saw Joyce lurching towards the newlyweds. The band stopped playing. "You bastard! Bastard!" Joyce screamed, flailing her arms as others attempted to restrain her. For a few minutes everyone stood still, in shock, until someone led her out of the hall. "Now drink, drink," people muttered, but they knew it was not simply drink. Vanessa and Tayo shared a stuffy railway carriage back to Oxford, just the two of them, he sitting on one side and she on the other, silent. He tried to start a conversation by joking about Nigerian weddings and the drama that came with them, but Vanessa wouldn't be moved. "And that crazy woman," Tayo added, in a final attempt to coax Vanessa into talking. Really, he felt sorry for Joyce and ashamed of the way he had avoided her, but he couldn't have risked anything more going wrong in front of Vanessa. Things were bad enough already. "Vanessa, you've been silent all afternoon. Surely it's not just because of the wedding." "I'm fine," she answered coldly. "No, you're not. I know you're not." "Yes, I am." Tayo watched as she continued to stare out of the window, occasionally combing her hair with her fingers. "Of course something's wrong. Well, why don't you tell me then, Tayo?" she said, turning to glare at him. "Tell you what? Tell me why you lied." "Lied? Well, let's start with Christine, shall we?" "Christine?" "Yes, Christine. Your old lover, the one you're supposed to be related to, remember? I'm not stupid, Tayo. Charlie told me a long time ago that you two were lovers, but I never believed him, and now it's so bloody obvious. You and all your bloody Nigerian friends just use white women, don't you? And you choose to listen to Charlie? Are you in love with him or something? Oh, for Christ's sake, stop trying to turn this into something else. Do you really think I couldn't work out who that poor woman was? You use us and then dump us for black women when you want to get married. Well, you obviously don't understand me or my culture." "Oh, so it's culture again, is it? Bloody culture," she shouted. "What a nice little excuse. And what do you call me dressing up like this in your Nigerian costume? Don't you think I'm trying to adjust to show you that I can fit in? Is that supposed to impress me?" he said, ignoring the fact that it had. "And it's not a costume, it's our national dress." "Fine, national dress, attire, call it whatever the hell you want. Happy now? Ready to tell me the truth? Or is this also cultural? Perhaps you don't call it lying in your culture." "You think that's funny?" "No, as a matter of fact, I don't think lying is funny. Vanessa, how many times do I have to tell you that I don't know what happened between Yusuf and Joyce? I really didn't know her well, and perhaps this marriage was arranged and you," she cut him short. "What happened between you and Christine?" "Nothing." "Nothing? How the hell can you say that? For goodness sakes, Vanessa, the woman's dead. Can't you show some respect for once? And all this swearing. Show some respect. What's that supposed to mean? You lied to me, Tayo. You told me you were related to her. Why don't you try a little respect? Vanessa, someone's going to stop the train because you're shouting. Let them! I don't care!" Tears were now streaming down her face. "Vanessa, please don't cry. I'm sorry. Please don't cry." He moved to sit next to her and tried to hug her, but she wouldn't let him. "I love you, Vanessa." He waited for her to grow calmer and then tried again to draw closer to her. "Moremi," he whispered, blowing at the little bits of confetti that refused to be dislodged from her hair. "No!" She burst into tears again. "Don't Moremi me! Stop bloody trying to turn me into a Nigerian!" "Fine," he said, this time letting go before she had time to push him away. "Forget this," he shouted. He stood up, walked out, and slammed the carriage door behind him. Chapter 15. The following week, Tayo tried patching things up, but the arguments persisted. He assumed that the pressure of study was partly to blame for the friction between them, which was why he looked forward to the holidays. Maybe then they could sort things out. But just as term was ending, Vanessa changed her mind. "I think we should spend Christmas apart," she said. And even though she said it without conviction, Tayo wasn't in the mood for discussion. If time apart was needed, so be it. He was tired of arguing, and, on top of that, did not wish to reveal their problems to the Barkers. But because the Barkers had been expecting both he and Vanessa to house-sit while they holidayed in Tuscany, he was obliged to say something to Mr. Barker, who then took it upon himself to suggest that Tayo be more patient and a little more sensitive when it came to women. Tayo listened out of respect, but on this occasion did not find the advice helpful. When the Barkers left for their holiday, Tayo set himself a strict schedule of work as a way of dealing with things. He used Mr. Barker's study on the first floor, and, for good measure, he took down the egungun mask that was propped up in one corner of the desk. As a Christian, he was not supposed to believe in the power of such things, but he wasn't going to take any chances. The British might be safe messing around with festival masks, but not him. He also removed Mr. Barker's journals that lay strewn on the windowsill, dusted their faded covers, and stacked them neatly to flatten the curling corners. The room was cluttered with history books, but the desk faced the window, away from the mess, overlooking the back garden, where he would often find himself staring and thinking of home. And sometimes he would think of nothing in particular as he watched the blackbirds hopping across the lawn, pecking in search of worms. Eventually he'd return to his books, and, if he still could not concentrate, he would stand up and wander around the house. He never grew tired of browsing the Barkers' bookshelves. In addition to history, Mr. Barker owned a large collection of musical scores, mainly classical and some jazz. Tayo remembered his first visit with Vanessa to the Barkers, and the way in which Mr. Barker had spoken to Vanessa at length about his collection. Tayo remembered feeling envious about their intimate tête-à-tête on a subject he didn't know much about. There were other books in the house, in German, French, and Italian, which were Isabella's, an impressive assortment of European and Russian literary greats, including a complete collection of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy. Tayo admired this vast assortment of books and the way the Barkers had decorated their house with a mix of Italian and English paintings, as well as the African bronzes and carvings that Mr. Barker had collected over the years. Tayo imagined owning a house like this one day, a home tastefully decorated and filled with books, a house which could be shared with friends in the same way as the Barkers shared theirs. Isabella, like Vanessa, collected beautiful things. Vanessa had transformed his own rooms with her thoughtful touches, the silver candlestick holders, the Spanish mirror, and a warm cashmere blanket. On New Year's Eve, Tayo awoke feeling particularly homesick. He thought of Tunde in Bradford, and Ike and Bolaji in London, preparing for the night's parties, and he pictured the scene back home in Nigeria. Women would be pounding yam, palm wine would be flowing, and the irresistible beats of high life and juju would be calling dancers to their feet. He began to feel that everybody except him would be in the party spirit, and so, to rectify the situation, he took out his favourite Ike Dairo vinyl and filled the house with his music. Then, on the spur of the moment, he decided to cook. By mid-morning, he was off to buy a chicken from the covered market. Realizing he didn't know what spices his mother used, he asked an Indian storeholder for advice. She sold him 2 powders, carefully sealed in wax paper. One marked cumin, the other turmeric. Tayo smiled to himself at the thought of a culinary adventure, but as soon as he got back to the house, the novelty of the idea had worn off. He'd never made stew in his life, so what did he think he was doing? Trying to be a modern man? Everyone knew that women were the natural cooks, not men. Besides, even if his chicken were a success, what joy would there be in eating alone? He thought of the time 2 years ago when Christine had prepared a banquet of his favourite food. She had cooked yam and akara, eba and egusi, and had invited all the African students in Oxford, as well as a few cousins from London. And that night, after they'd cleared everything away and were all alone, they'd spent their first night together. But it was still too painful to remember these things, so he tried to concentrate instead on looking for something in which to prepare his pasty white bird. He looked everywhere, but found no black pots of the type his mother owned, so he decided to use the largest stainless steel pot. Now what? How was he going to know when the chicken was properly cooked? None of Isabella's recipe books contained a chicken stew recipe. There was chicken soup, coq au vin, chicken vol au vent, coronation chicken, but no chicken stew, which meant he would have to guess. He had just finished chopping the bird into irregular chunks, 2 of which had slipped off the breadboard and sailed across the kitchen floor, when the doorbell rang. Oh no, this would be one of Isabella's friends sent to check on him. He must make sure nobody came into the kitchen and saw the mess. He picked up the chicken pieces and tossed them into a pot and ran to open the door. He expected to see either Fiona or Anne, but instead, there was Vanessa. In his excitement, he forgot that his hands were slimy with chicken pieces. As he reached to kiss her, she turned her face and the kiss landed clumsily on her cheek. "Come in," he said awkwardly. She sniffed the air, and so did he. "Yeo!" He panicked, running back to the kitchen. He pulled the pan of cumin and turmeric water from the ring, tipping it dangerously and nearly scalding himself. He stood helpless, wondering what to do next. Vanessa had followed him in. "Mr. Ajayi," she smiled. "What are you doing? And what does yeho mean?" "It means, oh bugger," Tayo laughed, "and this is my lousy attempt at cooking." "But who are you cooking for?" The smile left her face. "Are you expecting someone?" "Only you, Vanessa." "Me?" "Yes," he said, tossing her a tea towel. "And now you can dry the dishes." But I'm not staying, she added quickly. Then I'll have to entice you with a cup of tea, he said, knowing without looking that she was smiling. She could say what she liked. He knew she hadn't come all this way simply to say hello. He filled the kettle, switched it on, and turned to the stove to fiddle with his pot, all the while watching her from the corner of his eye. The heat from the oven had misted the kitchen window, and she'd taken off her cardigan. Static made her blouse stick to her body, and each time she tried to pull it away, the material leapt back, clinging to her breasts. He smiled and stepped closer, pretending to need a spoon in one of the drawers near where she stood, and when he brushed against her back, she stopped what she was doing. He waited for a moment before gently pulling her hair from her shoulders to plant a line of kisses down the back of her neck. Slowly, she turned towards him, and then, to bring her to his height, he lifted her up onto the counter, knocking over one of Isabella's teapots. Soon they were tugging clumsily at each other's clothes. Nothing else mattered, not the teapot, not the whistling kettle, and not the angry chicken spitting bubbles from its ill-fitting lid. Later that evening, they devoured a box of Ritz cheese crackers, a jar of Heinz pickles, and the rest of Isabella's Christmas fruitcake. They were clearing the plates when Vanessa reached for his arm and made him sit. "Tayo, we can't keep doing this, making up and patching things over." "I know," he said, but he wished she hadn't brought it up. Not now, not after what they'd just shared, not on New Year's Eve. "But you said you wanted a break, and now you've come back, and we've done all this, so I'm confused." "I didn't want a break, couldn't you see that?" And then she stood up again and began gathering the plates. "No, wait, Vanessa." This time he reached for her arm. "I'm sorry for being insensitive, and I'm sorry for burying myself in my work." "But it's not about work, Tayo. It's about the way we talk to each other, and me not being able to trust you. It's about the way you're sometimes so critical of my views. Yes, you are, Tayo. Every time we talk about religion or women's rights, you've always got something negative to say. It's as if I'm always saying something wrong." "But can't I tell you how I see things?" "Yes, but don't judge me at the same time." Did he judge her? Maybe she was right. Perhaps, in an unconscious way, he did judge her. He thought a lot these days about how his family would view Vanessa. He'd also wondered how she'd feel in a context where everyone was expected to believe in God. Whatever God, at least a God. Back home, women were expected to put children before profession and do the womanly things like cooking. Something he knew Vanessa did not agree with. "Aren't you going to say something?" she asked. "We've talked about Christine, Vanessa, and I've told you, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have lied to you, I'm sorry. And if I came across as critical, it's not because I intend to. It's just that sometimes I think of home, and when you talk about women having professions and not having children, I just worry that..." "Is that it? You think I don't want to have children?" "I don't know." "Then why don't you ask me? You never ask. How am I supposed to know if you don't tell me what you're thinking? Just because I defend a woman's right not to have children doesn't mean that that's my choice. Of course I want children." "You do?" "Of course I do, silly you. Come." She tugged at his arm, dragging him away from the mess in the kitchen, leading him to the lounge. "I love you, you know." "How much? How much do you love me?" "Too much," she smiled, holding him tightly. "I'll find some music and then I'll show you just how much. And you can make a fire." She chose Nina Simone, and before he'd found the matches, she was already dancing towards him. "Love me or leave me," she sang. He reached for her, but she pushed him away. "Vanessa," he pleaded, trying again to hold her, but she wouldn't have it. She sang in a whisper, flirting with him until she drew close enough for their hips to touch, and only then did she let him rest his hands on her waist. She kept on dancing, lifting her hips from side to side as she led the way backwards to the sofa.